Namyoho Renge Kyo Nam Namyoho Renge Kyo.
Hello everyone, Namu Myoho Renge Kyo. We're going to progress now into the opening of the eyes, and I'm going to read this passage. This may take a little time because this is, I don't know if controversy is the right word, but there's a lot of, I would say this passage is quoted by a lot of groups, organizations, sects, as it's misinterpreted, and it's used as kind of a political weapon. And I, for one, am really tired of seeing comments quoting this area of text as some kind of a bullying or aha, you're one of those, or any of that. It's just that behavior is so immature, infantile, and certainly, I would say, not even Buddhist. It falls outside the practice of Buddhism. So I think if you hear this passage quoted by somebody who's trying to impugn your practice or your teacher, beware of that person. They don't understand the teachings. And so I'm going to take my time going through this part, and I hope that doesn't annoy any of you, but I think it's really critical to practicing Buddhism correctly and understanding the Buddha's teaching, what he was after when he was talking about these things. And I know this is Nichiren's Gosho, and Nichiren's going to describe it from his perspective in his day, back in the 13th century. But it's amazing how much, if you keep that in mind, how much of what he's talking about appears in our contemporary world today, simply slightly different form. So I'll try not to be too pedantic, but it's really, because it's so misused, I think I really need to be clear. And if I'm not, let me know. Put it in the comments, okay? So we continue with, in the Gosho, in the Nirvana Sutra, the Buddha speaks as follows, quote, "After I have passed away," ellipsis, because he's repeated this statement along many times, "after the former day of the law has ended and the middle day of the law has begun," this is after his passing, "there will be monks who will give the appearance of abiding by the rules of monastic discipline, but they will scarcely ever read or recite the sutras, and instead will crave all kinds of food, drink, to nourish their body. Though they wear the clothes of a monk, they will go about searching for alms, like so many huntsmen who, narrowing their eyes, stalk softly. They will be like a cat on the prowl for mice, and they will constantly reiterate these words, quote, 'I have attained arhatship,' end quote. Outwardly, they will seem to be wise and good, but within they will harbor greed and jealousy. And when they are asked to preach the teachings, they will say nothing. Like Brahmins who have taken a vow of silence, they are not true monks. They merely have the appearance of monks. Consumed by their erroneous views, they slander the correct teaching." Okay, so that was quite a mouthful. What is Nichiren talking about here? And this is a quote from Shakyamuni Buddha. So, If you'll pardon me, I have to take my pills. Now, if you've followed any of my videos, I want you to consider for a moment, what is a monk? Again, we're referring to monks here. What is a monk? So, to refresh your memory, no pun intended, a monk is a dedicated student of Buddhism, in this instance. Which means I am a monk. And since you're watching this video, I assume in order to learn more about Buddhism and hopefully to help your practice along, guess what? You're a monk. Because that's what a monk is. A dedicated student of Buddhism. So, there's a big clue in this paragraph that what Shakyamuni Buddha himself, 2,700 years ago or 3,000 years ago, depending on the calendar you want to use, when he says, quote, I have attained arhatship, will be something you hear from these monks. That's a very, very specific statement. Arhatship? Do any of you know what an arhat is? He's referring to his own earlier teachings. So you've heard me talk about this before. Buddhism was taught in stages so that he could elevate the thinking, the mental condition of his students to the point where they would understand more and more complex ideas, thoughts, ways of understanding, how their mind works and how the entire, therefore, world and universe works. I'm not going to rehash all of that right now, although it's tempting. But this is Shakyamuni himself, so you don't have to take my word for it, or Nichiren's word for it, or Tendai's word for it. Shakyamuni is telling you there are going to be students, monks, students that I used to teach in my earlier teachings who will think themselves completely accomplished, that they no longer have anything to learn. And they will teach from those earlier teachings as though they are teaching the entirety of my teaching. This is Buddha. And he's calling them out. He says these people will be walking around like they're completely accomplished Buddhist monks. They will ask for support, ask for your money, beg with their bowls, like it's your duty. And in their culture, to be fair, this was the way the culture worked. There were no public schools. So the educated, the people who could read and write, they were scholars, and those scholars were usually, if not always, associated with a particular school, a religion, a philosophy. This is where the Brahmins come in, and he mentions them. Excuse my enunciation. So he's talking about you and me. He's saying if you think by reading and studying my earliest teachings without reading the entire breadth of what I've taught, all of it, as well as non-Buddhist thinking, you're incomplete. You cannot run around looking to be supported by people and giving them information as though you're fully accomplished. You're not. You're a fraud. So you see how this is used today, politically, as propaganda, to say your sect is nothing, your sect is nothing. You as an individual, mister, are one of those monks who pretends to know what they're talking about. You see how it's misused? Because what Nichiren is going to point out here is that this condition exists all the time, everywhere in our lives. People who pose, and this is a fallacy we ourselves do, especially as we're growing into our teens, in our 20s, we learn so much that we think when we finally get an aha moment that we're the authority. And it only takes another piece of the puzzle to drop on us at some point to make us humble and think, oh gosh, I thought I knew. I had no idea. Right? It's a human condition. So it happens. But as we read through this, I want to show you that rather than wielding this as some kind of a powerful litmus test for your learning, my learning, other teachers' learnings, and where I'm most concerned about this is groupthink. When this kind of thinking starts to infect a group, an organization, a sect, it stops learning. And not only does it stop the sect from learning or the group from learning, but it poisons the Sangha. Because the Sangha is an incredibly valuable association between us, humans, monks, that constantly propels us toward deeper knowledge, deeper understanding. And if we're halted in that pursuit, then our Buddhist practice is halted. And the worst part of that is that we walk around thinking we're done, when in fact we've just stopped our progress. So this is incredibly important to understand what's going on here. The admonition in this, and I think it's critical to take note, but they will scarcely ever read or recite the sutras and instead will crave all kinds of food and drink. In other words, they will satisfy or seek to satiate their human needs rather than their mind, their mental capacity. This is why I'm reading Gosho, for my practice and for yours, because this is study. You cannot stop study. Study is it's like swimming in the ocean. If you stop paddling, if you stop swimming, you are preparing to sink. Not only are you making no progress, bobbing, trying to breathe, but you will sink and you will terminate your journey. Think of it like that. So this is the first part of the paragraph. There will be monks who give the appearance of abiding by the rules, but they will scarcely read or recite the sutras, right? Though they wear clothes of a monk, they'll go about searching for alms like so many huntsmen, narrowing their eyes and stalking softly. So he's not talking about support in itself. It's a great cause to make to support the Sangha, our learning and our teaching, right? I do it as well. I have a Patreon account that you guys can use to help support me. But I'm not looking for you specifically. Hey, you money bags. I know you have money. Give me money. Do you see the difference? One is very egotistically driven. The other is sublime and vulnerable to you. Does that make sense? So let me go on next paragraph. And you can reread that paragraph. There's so much in it. Consumed by their erroneous views, they slander the correct teachings. So what are the correct teachings? They're the complete teachings. It's not that the early teachings are invalid. It's that they're only a stepping stone. They're only learning the alphabet. That doesn't qualify you to write a sonnet. You have to learn the language. You have to learn the grammar. You have to learn sentence structure, how to create a story, beginning, middles, and ends. You have to learn tons of stuff. Just knowing the alphabet doesn't qualify you as Shakespeare, right? This is what he's saying. Arhatship is something that was looked at as a pinnacle of achievement in the early teachings, the many sects of Hinayana, and even in Theravada, until Theravada finally started to incorporate the Lotus Sutra, but they've never incorporated it fully. They still talk about multiple lifetimes. They still talk about attaining arhatship. In the entire breadth of Buddhism, in the Lotus Sutra and the Nirvana Sutra, the final teachings of Shakyamuni Buddha, those people are considered to be Chantika, people of incorrigible disbelief. They're stuck. They think they are what they are not. They think they have achieved what they have not, in the words of the Gosho and sutras. This is an arrogant place, and it's very hard to break through. So this is, yes, there is quite a serious admonition here. But it shouldn't be used as a weapon. It should be used as a self-introspective check and balance. Where do I think I am? In the light of the sun and moon, the Gosho continues, that are the Lotus Sutra preached on Eagle Peak and the Nirvana Sutra preached at the Sal Grove, or in the bright mirrors that are the commentaries of Miaolo, of Piriying, and Chi Tu, of Tung Chun, we can discern without a trace of obscurity the ugly faces of the priests of the various schools of present-day Japan, especially the Zen, Precepts, and Nembutsu schools. The Lotus Sutra of the Wonderful Law says in the Encouraging Devotion chapter, quote, after the Buddha has passed into extinction in an age of fear and evil, and the, quote, Peaceful Practices chapter says, in the evil age hereafter, in the latter age, and in the latter age hereafter, when the law is about to perish, end quote. The Distinction and Benefits chapter says, in the evil age of the latter day of the law, the Medicine King chapter says, in the last 500-year period, and the Exhortation to Preach chapter of the Lotus Sutra of the Correct Law says, quote, in the latter age hereafter, and in the latter age to come. The same type of language is found in the supplemented Lotus Sutra of the Wonderful Law. Tendai states, quote, in the middle day of the law, the 3 schools of the south and 7 schools of the north are the enemies of the Lotus Sutra. And Dengyo says, quote, at the end of the middle day of the law, the scholars of the 6 Nara schools are the enemies of the Lotus Sutra. So once again, this continues to reinforce this idea of sectarian politics. Not without merit, but I want you today in 2020 to understand that you need to climb above this sectarian. I'm not saying this is wrong. What I'm saying is they're identifying very specific things in Japan in the 13th century of very powerful groups, very powerful sects that demand to be recognized at the end as the end-all be-all of Buddhist teachings, when they in fact only pick and choose and select a narrow group of sutras to declare as the full teachings of Shakyamuni Buddha. And they simply are not. They've simply chosen a point at which they can build a political argument to justify their existence. And believe me, religion was politics in those days. We still have vestiges of that today. Look at the tremendous difficulties we have all over the world, what Israel is doing to the Palestinians, what we as a nation are swayed by Christianity and as a political system. The leaders of these Christian sects, these evangelicals, have gotten into all our systems of government, and they're pushing harder and harder all the time for a religious bent to our societal controls and our governance. Look at jihad. Look at Arabian states. Look at the Muslim countries. There are peaceful and there are horrifically warring, all about how to control behavior of human beings. Okay, going to continue with part 2. Well, it's not part 2, but I'm going to continue with the opening of the eyes. In the time of Tendai and Dengyo, the 3 types of enemies mentioned above, in this case Nembutsu, Zen, and prefects? Yes. So, what we're discussing here is incomplete study, incomplete understanding of the whole of Buddhism. And this is something that can creep into all of us, right? Because human beings, we have a lazy nature. We get tired reading the same kind of thing all the time. That's why I think it's a benefit, actually. Shakyamuni makes a point of saying, don't just read all of Buddhist scholarship, all of it, not just part of it, all of it, but also non-Buddhist stuff. As I've said before, I read on science, I read on astronomy, I read on chemistry, I read on several things that are digging for fundamental truths. And it's amazing, the more you read, the more how everything seems very related and looking at the same thing, but just with a different mindset, right? It takes effort to think deeply about anything. So please do not be halted by visions or ideas that I've read enough, I know enough. With this knowledge, I'm therefore complete. This is what this part of the opening of the eyes is. Keep your eyes open. Keep expanding. Keep learning. Continue. Little bits, lots. Digest. Chant. Meditate on what you read. This will help you develop deeper insight. So these are the enemies. He may be pointing to certain people in this Gosho, but what is the lesson, the meaning, is that this is in all of us. These people, these ideas, these obstacles exist in all of us. So be mindful that they're there. We must recall that that when Shakyamuni Buddha, the Lord of Teachings, and many treasures Buddha sat side by side in the treasure tower like the sun and moon, and the Buddhas who were emanations of Shakyamuni had come from the 10 directions and were ranged beneath the trees like so many stars, then it was said that after the 1,000 years of the former day of the law, and the 1,000 years of the middle day of the law, at the beginning of the latter day of the law, there would be 3 types of enemies of the Lotus Sutra. How could this pronouncement made by the 800,000 million Nayutas of Bodhisattvas have been an empty or false prediction? Now, to understand that chapter, you have to have read or are reading the Lotus Sutra. He makes lots of references in here, just chapters of the Lotus Sutra, as well as now he's saying in the description of the sermon of the Lotus Sutra, he talks about this prediction for the 3,000 years into the future. And here it is. So it's not about being clairvoyant and predicting the future. It's about the nature of man and how these, whether you want to call them evils or obstacles or misinterpretations or distractions that take you away from your focus to your Buddha mind, they will continue to exist as long as humans and samsara exists. It is our condition. That's what you should take away from this. It's like reading a great novel that has so many lessons about human life. If you take apart Shakespeare's works, they may be great stories, but they all illustrate human fallacies, human wonders and amazement and evils, right? It's the human story. This is what Buddhism is about. It's about understanding human behavior to the point where we can release ourselves from the foibles and attractions of these lesser paths so that we can clearly see what is and should be always a beautiful, precious life. It is now some 2,200 years since the Thus Come One passed away. Even if it were possible to point straight at the earth and miss it, if the flowers were to cease blooming in spring, still I am certain that these three powerful enemies exist in the land of Japan. What I just said. If so, then who is to be numbered among the three enemies, and who is to be accounted a votary of the Lotus Sutra? It is a troubling question. Are we, I and my disciples, to be numbered among the three enemies, or are we to be numbered among the votaries of the Lotus Sutra? A troubling question. Well, here's the crux, right? So, rather than use those earlier words as quotations to be hurled against anyone, now it becomes obvious. Nichiren is saying, these obstacles exist. How do we know we're not part of it? How do we know, how do we distinguish ourselves in our practice from these others who feel they're so correct? How can we stand in judgment? Are we possibly just another one of them? It's a troubling question, yeah? So now he's going to give us tools so that we understand how we can do that, how we can identify correct from incorrect practice. Remember, this is the opening of the eyes. So he's not mincing any words here. He's wanting to get to the nitty-gritty of how to practice Buddhism correctly. In the 24th year of the reign of King Chao, the fourth ruler of the Chao dynasty, with the cyclical sign of Kinoe Tora, on the night of the 8th day of the fourth moon, a 5-colored light spread across the sky from north to south until all was as bright as noon. The earth shook in 6 different ways, and though no rain fell, the rivers and streams, wells and ponds brimmed with water. All the trees and plants bloomed and bore fruit. It was a wondrous happening indeed. King Chao was greatly surprised. The great historian Su Yu performed divinations and announced, quote, "A sage has been born in the western region. What about our country?" asked King Chao, to which Su Yu replied, "Nothing particular will happen for now, but 1,000 years from now, the words of this sage will be brought to this country and will bring benefit to all living beings." End quote. Su Yu was a scholar of non-Buddhist text, who had not in the slightest degree freed himself from illusions of thought and desire. And yet he was able to know what would happen 1,000 years in the future. And just as he predicted, 1,015 years after the Buddha's passing, the reign of Emperor Ming, the second ruler of the latter Han dynasty in the 10th year of the Yuping era, with the cyclical sign of Hinoto-u, the doctrines of Buddhism were introduced to China. So, as you know by now, Nichiren uses a lot of existing folkloric stories to relate to his audience. And really what he's pointing to here is the auspicious spread of Buddhism. On quite a different level is the prediction I have described above that was made by the various bodhisattvas in the presence of Shakyamuni Buddha, many treasures Buddha, and the Buddhas from the 10 directions that were emanations of Shakyamuni Buddha. In view of this prediction, how could the 3 types of enemies of the Lotus Sutra help but be present in Japan today? So he's representing the information again in a different way. In the Buddha's Successors Sutra, the Buddha is recorded as saying, quote, "After my passing during the 1,000 years of the former day of the law, there will be 24 persons in succession who will spread abroad the correct teachings as I have taught them." End quote. Mahakasyapa and Ananda were contemporaries of the Buddha, and so we will pass them over. But 100 years later, there was a monk, Parshva, 600 years later, Bodhisattva Ashvagosha, and 700 years later, Bodhisattva Nagarjuna, along with others, all appearing just as the prophecy had said they would. If so, how could the prophecy in the encouraging devotion chapter of the Lotus Sutra be in vain? If this prophecy were at variance with the truth, then the whole Lotus Sutra would be at variance with the truth. Then the predictions that Shariputra will in the future become the thus come one flower glow and Mahakasyapa will become the thus come one light bright would all be mere lies. In that case, the teaching put forward in the sutras that preceded the Lotus Sutra would be absolutely correct, and the voice hearers would be destined never to achieve Buddhahood. If it were true that one should give alms to a dog or a fox before giving them to a voice hearer such as Ananda, then where would we stand? So, again, he's reviewing the meat of the Lotus Sutra and how that teaching justifies itself. It places itself in the order of the teachings, another thing that's sometimes contentious with other sects. The passage from the Encouraging Devotion chapter mentions 3 groups of people, saying first that, quote, there will be many ignorant people. Second, that, quote, in that evil age there will be monks. And referring third to, quote, monks wearing clothing of patched rags. The first category of ignorant people are the important lay believers who support monks in the second and third categories. Accordingly, the great teacher Miao Lo, commenting on the people in the first group, says they represent the arrogance and presumption of lay people. And Tung Chung says that they will, quote, appeal to the government authorities, slandering the law and its practitioners. We see that happening all over the world right now, especially when it relates to Buddhism. Concerning the second group of enemies of the Lotus Sutra, the sutra says, quote, in that evil age there will be monks with perverse wisdom and hearts that are fawning and crooked, who will suppose they have attained This is exactly what I said earlier. Who will suppose that they have attained what they have not attained, being proud and boastful in heart. So obviously, if you've attained bodhisattva state in Buddhism, then you're not boastful in heart, right? Similarly, the Nirvana Sutra says, quote, "In that age there will be evil monks. These evil men will read and recite this sutra, but they will ignore and put aside the profound and vital principles that the Thus Come One has expounded in it." And this goes back to something else that I often repeat, the words of Shakyamuni, that the answers to the method of our mental investigation in Buddhism is not to be found in the words. It's to be found in the meaning of the words. And another reason why a lot of this part of the opening of the eyes gets misused and yielded as some sort of a weapon against people, that's a very arrogant thing to do, and it's very damaging to the one who's wielding the words that way, as well as to those who are impugned by it or judged by it. It's simply not Buddhist. And so that's the fundamental question, isn't it? Are we reading as a self-analysis to understand how we might better practice Buddhism and understand it? Because there's nothing in any of this Gosho, in any of the sutras, that is meant to teach those around you. It's about teaching yourself. All of these characterizations are in our own minds. And only when we understand that and can understand that and operate from that place can we then influence others correctly, without malice or arrogance, because that just doesn't belong in the teachings. These are all examples. If you learn about Red Riding Hood, you don't think that somehow eating children is a part of your practice of being a good human being. That's part of a story that illustrates a potential that should be avoided, that we should learn from, not emulate. So always study with this in mind. This study, these people, these things, these forces, these are things I battle in my own mind. Again, this is your enlightenment. This is your tool, your manual, to dissect your own thinking and mind and understand how your human mind can zing off into distinctions that are distractions rather than understanding where does that thinking come from. What is my deepest, earnest life? What is the force that moves me forward? We are movement. We are inertia. What is driving that inertia? How do I words falter. How do I direct it in such a way that it is always beneficent, beneficial, self-respectful, and respectful of life, all life? How do I direct it in that way, and away from influences that would have me do non-life affirming things, right? Great Concentration and Insight, that's a writing of Tyndai's, says, if one lacks resolute mind, in the Lotus Sutra, one will object that it pertains to the lofty realms of the sages, something far beyond the capacity of one's own wisdom to comprehend. If one lacks wisdom, one will become puffed up with arrogance and will claim to be the equal of Buddha. Right? So you can look at the teachings and say, this is beyond my capacity. I can read it, they're nice little stories, but I'll chant, but I can never do that. Or, on the other shoe, you can read it and go, I know that. I'm just as smart as Buddha. Both are tendencies, human tendencies, right? But if you constantly remind yourself, these are about dissecting what's going on in my mind, then you can start thinking, oh, yeah, I see that my little arrogant little voice in my head wanting to claim what it isn't. Or, I feel overwhelmed right now. Well, if you feel overwhelmed as you're reading Gosho, Sutra, so on, then take a moment, a breath, and chant. Chant about what you just read. Chant to understand it. There's nothing wrong with rereading either. I'm going to put a mark here, because this is where I'll continue in the next video. But for now, I'll close this video. Once again, thanking you so much for participating in my practice. You are my Sangha. Stay well these days. So much going on in the world. Namo Myoho Renge Kyo. Namo Myoho Renge Kyo. Namo Myoho Renge Kyo. Thank you. See you in the next one. Bye-bye.